They said no one stayed in Iron Ridge unless they had a reason or a wound. Eli Hart had both. Up there in the whispering pines, where phone signals died and silence lived like an old ghost, he built a life out of ashes, a one-room ranger station, a dog too old to chase, a past he didn't speak of, because the trees already knew it. Then came Clara Bell, paint-splattered jeans, big city breath, eyes that saw the forest not as danger, but as cathedral. She came looking for inspiration and found a man who didn't want to be found. A man who knew the weight of staying and the price of letting someone in. She thought the woods would change her. She didn't know they'd have to choose between her and him. Now I want to hear from y'all. What would you do if love found you at the edge of the map, with nothing but a brush, and a man who's forgotten how to hope? Drop your thoughts in the comments. If this kind of slow burn, pine-scented heartbreak speaks to you, don't forget to follow this campfire trail. The next chapter's coming soon. The Mogollon Rim Country, a rugged spine of red rock and ponderosa pine in northern Arizona, kept its secrets close. Eli Hart, a man weathered into his early 50s, was one of them. He lived a solitary life in an old, timber-framed ranger station, tucked deep within a canyon where the wind whispered tales only the ancient trees seemed to understand. His solitude wasn't by choice, not entirely. It had been thrust upon him years ago when the earth, in a sudden, violent shrug of a landslide, had claimed his wife, Martha, while they were out on a routine forest patrol. Since that day, Eli had become a fixture, as rooted and unyielding as the oldest pine. He'd refused every offer of a transfer, every suggestion he moved to a less isolated post. Protecting this particular stretch of wilderness, each whispering needle, each steadfast trunk, had become a silent, unyielding vow to her memory. His only steady companion was Rusty, a grizzled, mostly blind retriever mix whose own seasons were fading, a living link to Martha and the life they'd shared. Clara Bell arrived in the forest like an errant sunbeam piercing a shadowed glade. She was younger, perhaps in her late 20s, an artist from Santa Fe with a portfolio full of vibrant desertscapes, but a spirit currently as muted as a storm-clouded sky. A creative block, as stubborn and unyielding as a granite cliff, had driven her from the galleries and the polite chatter of the art scene. She sought a week of raw solitude, a communion with something elemental, hoping the untamed beauty of the Arizona high country might coax her muse from its hiding place. She packed her easel, paints, a small tent, and an optimism that felt increasingly fragile. For 3 days, the forest offered her little more than a deeper sense of her own inadequacy. Then, the mountain weather, notoriously fickle, turned. A sudden, torrential downpour, born of bruised purple clouds that had seemingly materialized from nowhere, sent her scrambling for shelter, disoriented, her hastily chosen path turning into a slick, treacherous slope. She slipped. Her ankle twisted beneath her with a sickening crunch, and she tumbled into a hidden nest of fire ants. The pain was immediate, incandescent, 1,000 tiny needles of agony. Eli found her near dusk, guided by Rusty's insistent, if weak, barking. She was semi-conscious, soaked to the bone, her exposed skin already swelling angrily from the ant bites. He said nothing, his face a mask of grim efficiency, with a strength that belied his lean frame. He lifted her, carried her through the relentless rain back to the ranger station, the old dog trotting faithfully, if slowly, at his heels, inside the small, lamplit cabin the air thick with the scent of pine smoke and brewing coffee. He tended to her. His touch was surprisingly gentle as he cleansed the bites with a pungent herbal concoction and expertly bandaged her swelling ankle. He moved with a practiced economy, his silence as profound as the forest outside. When Clara was finally coherent, propped up on a narrow cot with a rough wool blanket pulled to her chin, Eli Hart spoke, his voice as raspy as dry leaves. "This forest ain't a place for tourists. Ma'am, you should head back to wherever you came from soon as that ankle allows." Clara, despite the throbbing pain and the lingering shock, felt a spark of defiance. There was something about this man, the deep sorrow etched into the lines around his eyes, the way he seemed to carry the weight of the mountains on his shoulders. That intrigued her more than it intimidated. "I'm not a tourist," she managed, her voice still shaky. "I'm an artist, and I'm not leaving until I'm ready." Eli merely grunted, turning back to the stone hearth, his profile unyielding. The initial encounter was a standoff, a silent clash of wills in the heart of the wilderness. The days that followed were a slow, careful dance of proximity and distance. Clara, confined by her injury, found herself observing Eli's quiet routines. He rose before dawn, tending to the fire, checking his perimeter, his movements deliberate, almost ritualistic. Rusty, the old dog, became an unlikely ambassador. He'd often limp over to Clara's cot, resting his gray muzzle on the edge, his rheumy eyes offering a gentle, uncomplicated comfort. Clara, a lifelong animal lover, found herself talking to him in soft whispers, stroking his thinning fur, carefully cleaning the grime from around his nearly sightless eyes. Eli would watch these interactions from across the room, his expression unreadable, yet Clara sensed a subtle softening in his gaze when it rested on the old dog she was tending. One afternoon, as Clara sketched the play of light on the rough-hewn logs of the cabin wall, a sudden commotion outside sent Rusty into a fit of agitated barking. Eli was out checking a downed tree line. Clara, hobbling to the door, saw the source of the dog's distress, a large diamondback rattlesnake, coiled and ready to strike, near the woodpile where Rusty often napped. Before she could react, Rusty, with a burst of youthful courage that belied his age, lunged, placing himself between her and the snake. The snake struck, once, twice, its fangs sinking into the old dog's leg. Clara screamed Eli's name. He was there in an instant, his axe a blur, dispatching the snake. But Rusty lay whimpering, his leg already beginning to swell. For the next few hours, they worked side by side, a focused, desperate team. Eli lanced the wound, his hands surprisingly steady, while Clara, her own fear forgotten, applied a poultice of crushed herbs he directed her to find, her voice a low, soothing murmur as she comforted the distressed animal. They saved him, as Rusty finally drifted into an exhausted sleep, his bandaged leg tucked beneath him. Clara looked at Eli, his face smudged with dirt and concern, and saw not just a gruff recluse, but a man capable of profound tenderness. A fragile bridge had been built over a shared moment of crisis. As her ankle healed, Clara began to venture out a little further each day, her sketchbook in hand. She was drawn to a particular grove of ancient junipers, their gnarled branches reaching like supplicating arms towards the sky. There, half hidden amongst the wildflowers, was a small, weathered cairn of stones, so unassuming she might have missed it, had the light not caught it just so. It felt sacred, peaceful. She spent an afternoon sketching it, capturing the way the sunlight dappled through the leaves, the quiet dignity of the place. Later that evening, she left the finished sketch on the small table where Eli often ate his solitary meals. She heard him enter the cabin, the scrape of his chair, then a sharp, indrawn breath, followed by a sound that was almost a snarl. He strode towards her, his face a mask of cold fury, the sketch crumpled in his fist. "What do you think you're doing?" he growled, his voice raw with an emotion she couldn't name. "Spying on me, prying into things that ain't your concern." He held the sketch towards the fire, his intention clear. "No, Eli, please," Clara cried, reaching for it, bewildered by his reaction. "I didn't know." It was just a beautiful spot, peaceful. He stopped, his hand trembling, the anger in his eyes warring with a deep, visceral pain. He didn't burn it, he just stared at it, then at her, his gaze haunted. Without another word, he turned and stalked out of the cabin, leaving Clara shaken and confused, the crumpled sketch falling to the floor. The next morning, the sketch was gone from where she had left it. In its place, on the rough-hewn table, was a single sheet of paper, torn from some old ledger. On it, in Eli's angular, hesitant script, were just a few words. She loved it here too. "Maybe that's why I'm still stuck, Martha." The realization hit Clara with the force of a physical blow. That quiet, unassuming cairn was Martha's memorial, the place where he had, perhaps, scattered her ashes. His anger hadn't been about her trespassing on his land, but on his grief, his most sacred memory. His words, so stark, so vulnerable, were a crack in the wall he had built around his heart. A few days later, the sky, which had been a clear, aching blue, turned a bruised, ominous gray. The wind picked up, howling through the pines, and the temperature plummeted. "Hail!" Eli, his eyes scanning the churning clouds, began to move with a grim urgency, securing shutters, bringing in firewood, checking the integrity of the old cabin roof. Clara, wanting to help, hobbled out to assist him in covering a stack of tools near the lean-to. Just as they were wrestling with a heavy canvas tarp, the first hailstones, the size of quail eggs, began to fall with vicious force. One struck Clara on the temple, momentarily dazing her. She stumbled, her still weak ankle giving way, and fell hard, her arm catching on a protruding metal bracket. She cried out, a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the roar of the storm. Eli was at her side in an instant, his face pale. Her arm was clearly broken. He carried her back inside, the hailstorm now a deafening fusillade on the roof. For the next few days, he tended to her, setting the bone with a surprisingly gentle skill, fashioning a sling, brewing willow bark tea for the pain. He cooked for her, simple, nourishing meals. He sat by her cot through the long nights, listening to her fitful breathing, his own heart a tight, anxious knot in his chest. It had been so long since he'd cared for another living soul. Apart from Rusty, the responsibility, the vulnerability it evoked, made him tremble, not from the difficulty of the tasks, but from a terrifying, resurgent fear of loss, a fear he thought he had buried deep beneath layers of solitude and grief. One afternoon, as Clara drifted in a feverish sleep, her face flushed, a faint smile playing on her lips as Rusty lay pressed against her good side, Eli found himself staring at her. The way the faint sunlight from the small window caught the auburn highlights in her hair, the unconscious grace of her hand resting on Rusty's head. He reached for a piece of charcoal from the hearth and a scrap of smoothed birch bark he used for kindling, hesitantly at first, then with a growing, forgotten fluency. His hand began to move. He sketched her there, Clara and Rusty, a small, quiet scene of unexpected tenderness amidst the wildness. It was the first time Eli Hart had drawn anything at all, since Martha had praised his youthful sketches of wildflowers and soaring hawks so many long, lonely years ago. The charcoal whispered across the bark, a silent acknowledgment of a thaw, as gradual and as profound as the coming of a high-country spring. The charcoal sketch of Clara and Rusty, tucked away in a recess of Eli Hart's memory and a drawer in his rough-hewn desk, was a silent testament to the subtle shift occurring within him. As Clara's broken arm began to mend, the sharp edges of her pain dulled by time and Eli's surprisingly adept care, an unspoken understanding settled between them. The forest, which had initially seemed intent on expelling her, now held her in a tentative embrace, mirrored by the ranger's own reluctant hospitality. Clara knew she should leave. Her week of intended solitude had stretched into several, marked by injury and an unexpected, unsettling connection to this grieving man and his ancient dog. Yet, the thought of returning to Santa Fe, to the blank canvases and the suffocating expectations of the art world, felt like stepping back into a cage. One crisp morning, as Eli prepared his dawn patrol, she approached him, her arms still in a sling, but her resolve firm. "Eli," she began, her voice quiet but clear. I'm not ready to go back. Would you mind if I set up my tent near the station for a while longer? To paint. The light here is different." Eli didn't answer immediately. He continued to check the straps on his pack, his face unreadable. Clara's heart sank a little, bracing for a gruff refusal, but when he finally straightened, his gaze met hers, a flicker of something unidentifiable in their depths. Resignation, perhaps, or something softer. He merely grunted, a sound she was beginning to interpret as a reluctant affirmative. The next morning, she found a neatly stacked pile of dry firewood and a fresh pail of spring water outside the small tent. She had managed to erect a respectful distance from his cabin. No words were exchanged, but none were needed. Clara began to paint with a fervor she hadn't felt in years. Her subjects weren't the grand, sweeping vistas she'd once favored, but the intimate details of the forest, the intricate lace of lichen on a fallen branch, the angry scar of a lightning strike on an ancient ponderosa, the way sunlight fractured through the dense canopy to dapple the forest floor, the almost invisible tracks of a deer mouse in the damp earth. Eli would sometimes pause on his rounds, observing her from a distance as she sat hunched over her easel, her brow furrowed in concentration. He saw the way her eyes traced the contours of a broken limb, the sensitivity with which her brush captured the subtle shift of shadows. He began to see the forest, his forest, through her eyes, not just as a place of duty and memory, but as a living, breathing entity full of quiet, intricate stories. Their interactions remained sparse, measured out in shared cups of strong, bitter coffee in the misty dawns or brief exchanges about the weather. But slowly, like water seeping into dry earth, small pieces of their pasts began to surface. Clara spoke of a prestigious gallery show in Taos that had been a critical failure, the rejection sending her into a spiral of self-doubt that had silenced her creativity. Eli, in a rare moment of expansiveness, recounted the last time he and Martha had patrolled the high ridge together. The The way she had laughed as a cheeky blue jay dive-bombed them for a piece of her sandwich, just hours before the landslide. These shared vulnerabilities were like tentative handholds in the steep climb towards understanding. One afternoon, Clara ventured closer to a section of the forest Eli had gruffly warned her was best left alone. It was a dense, shadowed area, difficult to access, drawn by a peculiar stillness. She discovered evidence that made her blood run cold. Fresh drag marks from heavy machinery, newly sawn stumps bleeding sap, the distinct, acrid smell of diesel, illegal loggers. She hurried back to the station, her sketches of the damage clutched in her hand. Eli listened to her breathless report, his jaw tight. Been tracking 'em for weeks. He admitted, his voice low and grim. Slippery bastards. Come in at night. Different routes. Hard to catch 'em red-handed. Harder still to get proof that'll stick with the marshal down in Payson. I can help, Clara offered, spreading her detailed sketches on the table. I can document everything. Eli, every stump, every tire track. These drawings can be your proof. Eli stared at the sketches, his expression hardening. This ain't a place for art. Clara, this is about thieves and an unforgiving wilderness. It's dangerous. His resistance was momentarily reinforced by an unsettling encounter Clara had a few days prior, deeper in the woods. She'd come across a dilapidated lean-to, home to a gaunt, wild-eyed man named Silas, who seemed more creature of the forest than human. Silas, perhaps a disillusioned ex-trapper or a veteran seeking ultimate solitude, had fixed her with a knowing, almost pitying look. You with the ranger, he'd rasped. Best be careful. Girl, Hart, he ain't always about savin' folks. Seen him turn a blind eye when it suits him. Seen him let this forest swallow men whole. The words had planted a seed of unease in Clara. When she cautiously mentioned Silas to Eli, a muscle tightened in his jaw. Silas Blackwood, Eli said, his voice flat. Caught him running a string of illegal traps 5 years back. Nearly wiped out the beaver population in Willow Creek. Promised him a chance. Set him up with a small timber lease, legal and proper. He took the advance, clear-cut a whole protected hillside, and vanished with the money. Some men, Clara, you can't trust further than you can throw 'em. Nature, she's honest in her cruelty. Men like Blackwood, they just poison things. It was a glimpse into a past betrayal by humankind, a wound separate from the one nature had inflicted. The stalemate over Clara's offer to help with the loggers was unexpectedly broken by the arrival of a stranger on horseback. He was a wiry man, his face weathered, his eyes holding a familiar kind of weariness Clara recognized from Eli. Hart, the man called out, dismounting. Figured I might find you still holding down this fort. Eli's surprise was palpable. Jedediah, what in blue blazes are you doing this far west? They were old war buddies. Clara gleaned from their clipped, understated conversation over coffee. Vietnam, judging by their ages and the few oblique references to the jungle. As Jedediah spoke of old times, of patrols and ambushes, a different picture of Eli began to emerge. Still patchin' folks up. Eli, Jedediah asked, a knowing look in his eye. He turned to Clara. This fella here, ma'am, was the best damn medic in our company. Pulled more men out of the fire than a saint. Knew the jungle like the back of his hand. Knew every plant that could heal you or kill you. Eli shifted uncomfortably, a flush rising under his weathered skin. A medic. It explained his skill with her injuries, his knowledge of herbs, his profound, almost preternatural understanding of the forest's rhythms. But it also hinted at deeper scars. The war, the constant exposure to death and suffering, then Martha's sudden, violent end, and perhaps a disillusionment with a world that moved on too quickly from such traumas. All of it had contributed to his retreat, his long, silent communion with the trees. His PTSD was a quiet, deeply buried thing. Later, after Jedediah had ridden on, Clara found Eli staring out at the endless expanse of pines, his shoulders slumped. She didn't try to pry, didn't offer platitudes. She simply said, her voice soft, "You don't have to speak. Eli, the trees already heard." He looked at her then, a flicker of gratitude, of profound relief, in his eyes. With Eli's reluctant agreement, Clara began her meticulous documentation of the illegal logging, her artist's eye for detail proving invaluable. She sketched the specific blaze marks on trees slated for felling, the unique tread patterns of the logger's aging truck, even quick, furtive portraits of the men themselves when she could glimpse them from a safe distance. One afternoon, while exploring a small, secluded box canyon near a spring Martha had apparently favored, Eli had mentioned it once in passing, Clara stumbled upon something extraordinary. Tucked into a dry crevice between two large boulders, protected by an overhanging ledge, was an old, weathered ammunition box. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were a bundle of letters. They were in a delicate, feminine hand, addressed to my dearest Eli, but none of them had ever been posted. They were Martha's. With a trembling heart, Clara sat by the spring and began to read. The letters were a chronicle of Martha's love for Eli, her joy in their shared life in the wilderness, but also her quiet awareness of the risks, the impermanence of things. In a letter penned only weeks before her death, Martha wrote, "This forest, my love, it gives and it takes. If it should ever decide to take me, know that I go as part of its breath, its cycle. Don't let my shadow keep you from the sun. Eli, live, find the light through the trees, as we always did together." Tears streamed down Clara's face as she read. Martha's words were not a lament, but a gift, a release. She understood, with a profound clarity, the depth of Eli's bond with this place, and the way his grief had become intertwined with its very soil. That evening, Clara didn't show Eli the letters directly. Instead, she took one of her most detailed sketches of the memorial cairn, the one he had almost burned, and carefully, in her own artistic script, she transcribed a passage from Martha's last letter onto the border of the drawing. "Find the light through the trees, as we always did together." She left it on his table, propped against his coffee cup, and retreated to her tent. Hours later, as the moon cast long shadows through the pines, she saw the flicker of his lantern approaching. He stopped before her tent, the drawing in his hand. He didn't speak for a long moment, simply stood there, bathed in the moonlight, his face etched with an emotion too profound for words. "Where?" he finally managed, his voice thick, "near the old spring," Clara said softly. "In an ammo box." Her letters. "Eli," he nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the drawing, to Martha's words intertwined with Clara's art. He looked up at Clara, and for the first time, she saw not just the grief, but the beginning of a fragile, hesitant peace in his eyes. The firewood and the paint, the things said, and the many more left unspoken, had finally begun to bridge the chasm of his loss. The forest, which had witnessed his deepest sorrow, now seemed to offer a quiet promise of healing. a path towards finding the light once more. The fragile peace Eli Hart had begun to find, nurtured by Clara Bell's quiet presence and the echo of his wife Martha's words, was as tenuous as the early morning mist clinging to the canyon walls. The illegal loggers were still a festering wound on the land, and Eli, armed now with Clara's meticulously detailed sketches and a renewed, if somber, sense of purpose, pushed deeper into their shadowy operations, he began leaving before dawn and returning long after dusk, his silence more preoccupied, his eyes holding the grim focus of a man tracking a dangerous predator. One evening, the moon, a sliver of silver in the ink-black sky, rose higher and higher, and Eli did not return. Rusty, sensing the void, whined softly by the cabin door, his old head cocked towards the silent forest. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, coiled in Clara's stomach. She knew the risks he was taking. By midnight, the dread had solidified into a certainty. Something was wrong. Leaving Rusty with a bowl of water and a reassuring pat, she grabbed a lantern and Eli's spare rifle, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, and stepped out into the vast, listening darkness. She followed the faint, almost invisible trail Eli had taught her to recognize, her own senses sharpened by weeks in the wilderness. The path led her towards a narrow, treacherous gorge, a place Eli had warned was prone to rock falls and favored by the loggers for its remoteness. As she neared the lip of the gorge, the sudden, sharp crack of a rifle shot ripped through the night, followed by another, then a man's guttural cry of pain that wasn't Eli's. Her blood ran cold. Peering cautiously over the edge, she saw them in the faint, flickering light of a poorly banked campfire. 3 loggers, their faces brutal in the dim light, and Eli, cornered against a rock face, clutching his side, his own rifle lost in a desperate scramble. He was trapped. Without thinking, Clara raised Eli's rifle, not to fire, but to create a diversion. She aimed high, at a loose scree slope above the loggers' camp, and squeezed the trigger. The shot echoed like thunder in the confined space. Rocks and debris rained down, missing the men but causing instant chaos. "Sheriff's posse," Clara yelled, her voice amplified by the canyon walls, hoping the bluff would buy Eli precious seconds. In the ensuing confusion, as the loggers scrambled for cover, Eli lunged for a shadowed crevice, disappearing into the darkness. Clara, her heart hammering, didn't wait. She knew they'd be after her next. She snapped a quick mental image of the scene. The felled trees, the loggers' faces, their discarded tools. Her artist's mind already composing the damning evidence. Then she turned and fled, scrambling deeper into a narrow fissure in the rock. The loggers' enraged shouts echoing behind her. She wedged herself into the tightest part of the crevice, praying the darkness would conceal her. Hours seemed to pass. Then, a faint scraping sound from above. Eli, he'd circled back, risking everything. He lowered a length of rope, his voice a ragged whisper. "Clara, you all right?" With his help, she scrambled out, emerging scraped and bruised but alive. Eli's face was grim, a dark stain spreading on his flannel shirt where a bullet had grazed his ribs. "We need to move," he said, his voice tight with pain and urgency. They found refuge in a shallow cave higher up the canyon wall, a place Eli knew from his years of roaming these hills. It was cramped and cold, but for now, it was safe. Eli tended to his own wound with a practiced hand, his movements economical despite the pain. Clara watched him, the adrenaline slowly ebbing, leaving her trembling and exhausted in the enforced intimacy of that cold, dark cave, with the distant shouts of the loggers a fading threat. The carefully constructed walls around Eli Hart finally crumbled. He began to speak, his voice low and gravelly, not of the loggers or their immediate peril, but of Martha. She was a geologist. You know, he said, staring out at the sliver of moon visible through the cave opening. Loved these rocks more than most people. Said they told stories. If you knew how to listen, he talked about her boundless curiosity, her infectious laugh, the way she could identify every mineral, every stratum. He spoke of their shared dream of this forest, not just as a sanctuary, but as a living laboratory, a place of endless discovery. She wasn't just taken by the landslide. Clara, she was studying it, knew the risks. It was part of what she loved, the wildness, the power of it. He paused, the silence heavy with unspoken grief. I stay, he finally whispered, because every damn tree, every rock, holds a piece of her. It's like I'm keeping her research alive. Finishing the chapter she never got to write. Tears welled in Clara's eyes, spilling unheeded down her cheeks. Maybe, she choked out, her voice thick with emotion. Maybe I'm also painting to hold on to what's being lost, to keep it from vanishing. He looked at her then, a deep, soul-weary understanding passing between them. They didn't kiss, they didn't touch, but the silence in that cold, dark cave was no longer empty. It was filled with shared sorrow, shared purpose, and the dawning of a profound, unspoken connection. Their ordeal in the gorge was soon overshadowed by a different kind of fury. A dry lightning storm swept through the Mogollons a few nights later, igniting a wildfire that, fanned by erratic winds, raced towards the lower slopes, towards the very area where Clara had first pitched her tent. The acrid smell of smoke, a terrifying orange glow on the horizon, roused them from a fitful sleep. There was no time for fear, only action. Eli, his medic training kicking in, his movements swift and decisive, despite his still tender ribs, began organizing a defense. Clara, her own terror pushed aside, worked beside him. They alerted Silas Blackwood, the hermit, whose grudging respect for Eli outweighed his past grievances when faced with a common enemy. Together, the three of them worked through the smoke-filled night, cutting fire breaks with an almost desperate intensity, evacuating a small herd of deer trapped in a box canyon, beating back the encroaching flames with wet sacks and shovels. Official help was hours, perhaps days, away. Clara had never witnessed such raw, untamed power. The fire was a living entity, beautiful and terrifying in its destructive dance. It was a stark reminder that not all loss was human-caused, that nature's justice was impartial, and that some things, no matter how desperately one might try, could not be sketched, captured, or saved by art alone. It was a humbling, terrifying, and strangely clarifying experience. When the rains finally came, dousing the last of the flames, a vast swath of the forest was charred and blackened. Among the casualties was an ancient, towering ponderosa pine that Eli had often pointed out to Clara, a tree Martha had particularly loved, one she'd sketched in her own field journals. It now lay a smoldering giant, its roots exposed, its long life concluded. Eli stood before it for a long time, his face unreadable in the smoky dawn. It felt, to Clara, like a final, painful letting go a closing of a chapter that nature itself had ordained. In the weeks that followed, Clara's detailed sketches and photographs of the loggers and their illegal activities, combined with Eli's damning testimony and the evidence from the gorge, finally led to arrests. The local marshal, spurred by the undeniable proof, brought the full weight of the law down on the operation. Clara's art, born of her connection to the forest and her desire to protect it, had become a potent weapon for justice. News of her work, and the dramatic story behind it, began to filter out, partly through Jedediah, who had connections to a Santa Fe newspaper. Her name, linked with the wild, untamed beauty of the Mogollon forest, started to gain a quiet renown. This unexpected recognition, however, brought a new, insidious threat. A smooth-talking land developer from Phoenix, a Mr. Harrison Vance, arrived at the ranger station, his city clothes and polished demeanor a stark contrast to the rugged landscape. He spoke of progress, of sensitive development. He'd seen Clara's work, heard of the pristine wilderness, and proposed to buy a vast tract of land adjoining the national forest. Land that included the very spring where Clara had found Martha's letters. His vision, an exclusive, eco-friendly luxury resort, complete with nature trails, art workshops, and, he added with a magnanimous smile towards Clara, a Clarabelle outdoor art sanctuary as its centerpiece. Eli's reaction was a low, guttural growl of contempt. He saw through Vance's slick pronouncements to the greed beneath, but Clara found herself, to her own surprise, momentarily hesitant, an art sanctuary in her name. The recognition, the chance to merge her passion with this place she had come to love, it was a powerful lure. Tapping into ambitions she thought she had laid to rest, Vance pressed his advantage, speaking of conservation easements, of minimal impact, of creating a legacy. "Imagine, Miss Bell," he said, his voice persuasive, "your art inspiring thousands, preserving this beauty in a way that also allows others to experience it responsibly." Of course, it was a potent temptation, a fork in the trail. One path led back towards the world of recognition, of accolades, of a carefully curated version of wilderness. The other led deeper into the heart of the forest, into the quiet, demanding life she had found with Eli, a life dedicated not to showcasing beauty, but to fiercely protecting its untamed soul. She looked at Eli, at the unwavering resolve in his eyes, the deep love for this land etched into every line on his face. She thought of Martha's letters, of the fire, of the fallen Ponderosa, of the quiet strength she had discovered within herself in this rugged, unforgiving, and profoundly healing place. Her choice, when it came, was as clear and as unshakable as the ancient red rocks surrounding them. The journey back from the gorge was a silent one, each step heavy with the unspoken realities of their shared ordeal. Eli Hart, his makeshift bandage already darkening with blood, moved with a grim determination, while Clara Bell, her artist's mind replaying the moonlit ambush, felt a new, steely resolve solidifying within her. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her belly, but it was now overlaid with a fierce, protective anger. This forest, which had offered her solace and a hesitant awakening, was under siege, and she, an accidental witness, had become an unwitting soldier in its defense. Back at the ranger station, the familiar scent of pine and wood smoke, a balm to their frayed nerves. Clara wasted no time, while Eli, with a stoicism that both awed and worried her, cleaned and redressed his wound, She spread out her salvaged sketching supplies. For hours, she worked with a feverish intensity, her charcoal flying across the paper, her memory sharp and unforgiving. She drew the loggers' campsite with an architect's precision, the felled ancient trees like fallen warriors, the make and distinctive markings of their dilapidated truck, the brutal, careless faces of the men illuminated by the harsh memory of their campfire. Her art, once a means of personal expression, now became a weapon, each stroke a piece of damning evidence. Eli watched her, a profound weariness in his eyes, but also a dawning respect for the quiet strengths, the unexpected fierceness, in this woman he had rescued from the rain. Together, they compiled the report, Eli's terse, factual account of the illegal operation, his own observations meticulously recorded over weeks, was now powerfully corroborated by Clara's vivid, irrefutable visual testimony. He even included the quick, blurry photograph she'd managed to snap with her small box camera during the chaos of her diversion. A lucky shot that captured one of the loggers red-handed with a saw. With the report sealed, Eli prepared for the long ride to the nearest town with a telegraph line, the only way to ensure it reached the State Forestry Department without further interference. He left Rusty in Clara's care, a silent acknowledgement of the trust that had grown between them. The days Eli was gone stretched with an agonizing slowness. Clara divided her time between tending to Rusty, reinforcing the cabin's simple defenses, and working the small cabin radio Eli used for infrequent official communications. She managed, after several frustrating attempts, to reach a board dispatcher at the regional forestry office, relaying a condensed version of Eli's report and their precarious situation. Emphasizing the photographic evidence and detailed sketches, the dispatcher, initially dismissive, became more attentive when Clara mentioned specific statutes the loggers were violating, details Eli had drilled into her. He promised to pass the information up the chain. The loggers, however, were not inclined to wait for due process. 2 nights after Eli's departure, they returned, not with saws, but with malice. They came like wraiths in the darkness, intent on silencing the ranger and destroying any proof. The crack of wood splintering as they kicked in the cabin door jolted Clara from a light sleep. Rusty, despite his age and near blindness, erupted in a frenzy of protective barks, throwing himself towards the intruders. Clara scrambled for the rifle Eli had left her, her heart hammering. One of the men, burly and reeking of stale whiskey, lunged for her precious portfolio of sketches. "Looky here, boys. Pretty pictures for the judge," he sneered. It was then that something snapped within Clara. This wasn't just about her, or even Eli. It was about the forest, about Martha's memory, about the silent, ancient life they were trying to annihilate. "Get your filthy hands off that," she screamed, her voice raw and surprisingly powerful. And as Eli, drawn by the commotion and returning under the cover of darkness far sooner than expected, burst through the back door like a vengeful spirit, Clara found herself shouting the words that had been burning in her soul. "This forest is not yours to take." The fight was brutal and short. Eli, fueled by a cold rage, moved with the deadly efficiency of a man pushed too far. Clara, armed with a heavy iron skillet, defended her corner, and Rusty with a ferocity that surprised even herself. Just as the situation threatened to turn truly deadly, the welcome sound of approaching horses and authoritative shouts filled the night. The forestry police, alerted by Clara's earlier radio message and Eli's telegraphed report, which had, against all odds, reached a sympathetic supervisor, had arrived. The loggers, caught in the act, surrounded by the evidence of their vandalism and assault, were swiftly apprehended. In the trembling quiet that followed, the cabin a wreck of overturned furniture and shattered belongings, Eli finally turned to Clara. His face was bruised, his knuckles raw, but his eyes held a deep, aching tenderness. "Clara," he said, his voice hoarse, "you need to leave. For good this time. This place. What it brings. It'll swallow you whole. I won't see that happen to you." She looked at him, at this strong, solitary man, so terrified of feeling, of losing again. "Eli," she said softly, her gaze unwavering, "I don't think it's the forest that scares you. It's what you might feel again, for someone still living." His silence was her answer. In the weeks that followed, as a fragile peace settled over the ranger station, Clara didn't leave. Instead, she began to reclaim the scarred land in her own way, on a patch of earth blackened by the recent wildfire. Not far from where the ancient ponderosa had fallen, she started a small, informal art class for the handful of children from the nearby scattered homesteads and a couple of shy, curious Apache children from a settlement further down the valley. Their canvases were smoothed pieces of fallen bark. Their paints, crushed berries, colored clays Eli helped them find, and charcoal sticks salvaged from the fire's remnants. They drew the new wildflowers pushing through the ashes, the intricate patterns of insect wings, the way light filtered through the recovering canopy. Eli, at first a silent, watchful presence on the periphery, found himself drawn in. He'd identify a particular bird call for a child, explain how a certain plant was used by his grandmother for medicine, or recount old tales of the forest spirits. He began to smile more. His laughter, when it came, a rusty but genuine sound that warmed Clara to her core. He was becoming their storyteller, their gentle guide to the ecosystem's delicate balance. The loggers' rampage had caused more than just visible destruction. Eli discovered that a cluster of rare, wild beehives, home to a unique species of golden native bee that Martha had been studying, a bee that only thrived in the most pristine old-growth areas, had been smashed. The men likely after the honey and wax. The loss of these crucial pollinators was a deep blow to the forest's intricate web of life. It was Clara who suggested a way to fight back, not with anger, but with beauty and hope. "Let's have an exhibition." "Eli," she proposed, "my paintings of the forest, the children's nature art. We can raise money, awareness. We can create a fund to help restore this area, to bring back what was lost. You could lead the work." The idea took root. With the help of Jedediah and the journalist who had once interviewed her, word spread. The exhibition, held in a small community hall in Pesos, was a surprising success. Clara's powerful, evocative paintings, alongside the children's innocent, vibrant depictions of their wounded but resilient forest, touched a chord. The story of the golden bees, symbols of the forest's fragile heart, became a rallying cry. Funds were raised, enough to begin the slow, patient work of habitat restoration for the bees and other affected wildlife, with Eli, his hands now tending to new life instead of just guarding old memories. At the helm, the exhibition also brought another, unexpected offer. A prestigious gallery in Santa Fe, the very one that had once rejected her, now sought her out. They offered Clara the position of lead curator for a new wing dedicated to ecological art, with a generous salary and significant influence in the art world. It was everything she had once dreamed of. The only condition, She would need to be based in Santa Fe full-time. The art market, Miss Bell, the gallery director explained smoothly, requires consistent, long-term presence. It was the ultimate test. Fame, influence, financial security, or this quiet, demanding, profoundly fulfilling life she had carved out with Eli in the heart of the wilderness. She talked it over with Eli one evening, as they sat on the porch of their small cabin, Rusty asleep at their feet, the scent of sage and recovering pine heavy in the air. He listened patiently, his gaze fixed on the distant, star-dusted peaks. "If you go, Clara," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm, his love for her a palpable presence between them. "Go full-hearted. Don't you be looking over your shoulder, waiting for something green to pull you back here. This forest, it'll still be here. I'll still be here. But your life, it's yours to choose." He gave her his blessing, his selfless love, a painful, beautiful gift. Clara spent many days in contemplation, walking the familiar trails, her sketchbook often forgotten as she simply absorbed the sights, the sounds, the very essence of the place that had reshaped her. She thought of the gallery lights, the polite applause, the intellectual sparring, and then she thought of the children's laughter echoing through the trees, the satisfying ache in her muscles after a day working with Eli on the bee habitat, the profound peace of his presence beside her as they watched the moon rise over the Mogollons. A week later, she mailed a letter to Santa Fe, a polite but unequivocal refusal. Then, she took out a fresh canvas, her largest yet. She began to paint, not for an exhibition, not for acclaim, but for herself, for Eli. Her subject was the ranger station, nestled in its embrace of pines, smoke curling from its chimney, Rusty on the porch, and Eli standing by the corral, his silhouette strong and enduring against the backdrop of the vast, wheeled land. She called it, simply, the unmapped place. It was there, in that place not found on any conventional map, that her heart and her art had finally found their true north. The unmapped place. Clara Bell's poignant painting of Eli Hart's ranger station became not an end, but a new beginning. Her decision to refuse the prestigious gallery position in Santa Fe was a quiet declaration, a choice made not in sacrifice, but in profound affirmation of the life she had discovered, the woman she had become, in the heart of the Mogollon wilderness. With Eli's unspoken blessing, a quiet understanding that now flowed between them as surely as the hidden springs in his forest. Clara stayed. For the next year, a full cycle of seasons, she dedicated herself to a new, ambitious project, creating a living map of the forest they both cherished. It wasn't a map of trails and elevations, but of time, of change, of the subtle, intricate lifeblood of the wilderness. Her easel became a fixture in sun-dappled glades and shadowed canyons. She painted the first tender green shoots of spring wildflowers, pushing defiantly through the fire-scarred earth, their resilience a quiet rebuke to destruction. She captured the violent, life-giving fury of the summer monsoon rains, the ephemeral waterfalls cascading down red rock cliffs, the air thick with the scent of wet pine and ozone. Autumn brought canvases alive with the fiery golds of aspen groves, the southward drift of migrating birds etching fleeting patterns against an achingly blue sky, and the rustle of unseen creatures preparing for the lean months. Winter, her favorite, was a study in muted tones, the stark, sculptural beauty of snow-laden branches, the delicate tracery of frost on dormant roots, the deep, resonant silence of a forest at rest. Each painting was a story, a moment held captive, a testament to the enduring spirit of the place. Eli, no longer just a distant observer, became an integral part of her process. He'd lead her to hidden groves where rare orchids bloomed, point out the fresh tracks of a reclusive mountain lion, or share the ancient names the Apache had given to certain peaks and valleys. He spoke more freely now, not in torrents, but in quiet observations, his knowledge of the forest a deep, inexhaustible well. Sometimes, when she held her children's art classes near the recovering bee habitat, he would sit with them, his voice, once raspy with disuse, now warmed by their eager questions as he explained the delicate dance between the golden bees and the wildflowers. He even learned the names of all the children, a small miracle in itself. Clara's Forest Heart series, which included these seasonal studies, began to find its way beyond the small community hall in Payson. Jedediah, Eli's old war buddy, had shown some prints to an editor he knew at a prominent environmental journal. Soon, reproductions of her work, accompanied by excerpts from her keenly observed journals, appeared in magazines dedicated to wilderness preservation, her art carrying a quiet but potent message. Her name, once a whisper in Santa Fe galleries, now became synonymous with the fierce, fragile beauty of the Arizona high country. This collection of paintings, The Living Map, was eventually slated for a permanent exhibition at the state's Natural History Museum, a vibrant, enduring legacy for generations to come. Then, one crisp fall afternoon, weeks after Clara had traveled to Prescott to finalize arrangements for the museum exhibit and to meet with a publisher interested in a book of her forest paintings and writings, a dusty mail carrier delivered a small, carefully crafted wooden box to Eli at the ranger station. He recognized the smooth grain of fire-scarred ponderosa pine, the kind he and Clara had salvaged after the big blaze. Inside, nestled on a bed of dried moss, was one of Clara's earliest, well-worn sketchbooks, the one she'd had when she first stumbled into his life, and a crisp, formal invitation. It was for a solo exhibition of her work, not in some small regional gallery, but at one of Santa Fe's most prestigious art institutions. Tucked beneath the invitation was a handwritten note from Clara, her familiar script clear and strong. "You kept the forest alive for so long. Eli, let me, just for a little while, keep you in it, for others to see." The journey to Santa Fe was, for Eli, like stepping onto another planet. He hadn't been in a city of that size for nearly 2 decades. The noise, the people, the sheer overwhelming press of humanity made his skin prickle. He wore a new denim shirt Clara had quietly left for him before her departure, its fabric still stiff, its collar unfamiliar against his weathered neck. He felt as out of place as a gnarled old juniper transplanted into a formal rose garden. The gallery was a hushed, elegant space, a world away from the raw, windswept beauty of his ranger station. But as he walked through the rooms, he saw his forest reflected back at him through Clara's eyes. There was the intricate detail of a hawk's feather, the fierce resilience of a wildflower blooming from ash, the profound peace of a snow-covered canyon. Her Living Map series dominated one wall, a breathtaking testament to the passage of time and the enduring spirit of the wilderness. And then he saw it, the centerpiece of the exhibition, a canvas larger and more ambitious than anything else. Its title was simple, yet resonated deep within him. "When Trees Remember Names." It was him, Eli Hart, standing steadfast in the heart of a shadowed forest, a storm lantern held high in one hand, its golden light pushing back the encroaching darkness. Behind him, the faint, almost ghostly glow of a distant forest fire, its embers still alive, and within that fiery haze, the ethereal, barely discernible silhouettes of two figures. One, perhaps Martha, her hand resting on his shoulder as she so often had. The other, perhaps a premonition, a hope. The trees in the painting seemed to lean in, ancient and wise, their bark etched with the memories of all who had sought shelter beneath their boughs. He saw his own grief there, his solitude, but also a resilience he hadn't recognized in himself, a stewardship he had carried for so long it had become a part of his very bones. Eli, he turned. Clara stood there, her eyes shining, a soft smile playing on her lips. She wore a simple dress the color of dusk, and around her neck was the small, fire-scarred wooden pendant he'd carved for her months ago, a tiny, imperfect pine cone. She didn't offer platitudes about his journey, didn't ask if he liked the exhibition. She simply held out her hand. He took it, his calloused fingers closing around hers, a silent acknowledgement of everything that had passed between them, everything that still lay ahead. Without a word, they walked out of the gallery, away from the polite murmurs of the art patrons and the hushed reverence of the room. Behind them, the forest lived on canvas, a captured echo of its wild heart. Before them, through the gallery's wide glass doors, the distant smudge of mountains under a vast New Mexico sky hinted at the real forest, the one that was still out there, waiting for their return. They drove back to the Mogolons the next day, the silence in Eli's old truck comfortable, filled with an unspoken understanding. When they finally reached the familiar turnoff to the ranger station, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows through the pines, Eli pulled to a stop. "There's something. I made it a while back," he said, his voice a little rough. He led her not to the cabin, but to the small, sheltered spot where her easel often stood, overlooking the recovering valley. Resting on the easel, where a blank canvas usually awaited her inspiration, was a small, exquisitely crafted box. It was made from the same fire-scarred ponderosa pine as the one she had sent him, its surface smoothed and oiled to a soft sheen. Clara's breath caught. She lifted the lid. Inside, on a bed of faded deer hide, was a single, perfect hawk feather, and beneath it, burned carefully into the wood itself, were the words, "I can't promise you city lights, Clara, but I can promise you northern stars." Every night, a laugh, bright and clear as a mountain spring, bubbled up from Clara's chest. It was followed by a long, contented sigh that seemed to release the last vestiges of any lingering doubt, any whisper of a life unchosen. She turned to Eli, her eyes dancing, her love for this quiet, steadfast man as vast and as elemental as the wilderness that surrounded them. "Good," she said, her voice soft, yet full of an unshakable certainty, "because I was never looking for lights anyway. Eli, only for a place to finally see, and under the vast, silent canopy of the Arizona pines, with the first of the northern stars beginning to prick the darkening sky, they stood together, two souls rooted in the wild, their unmapped place, finally, and forever, home. Ma foi, what did you feel, out there in the pines with them? Was it peace? Regret? Or maybe the kind of quiet that only comes when two broken people find something worth staying for? I'd truly love to know what this story meant to you. Leave a comment below your thoughts. Help shape where we ride next. And if you want more stories like this about healing, hard choices, and unexpected love under open skies. Hit that subscribe button and stay close. The fire's still warm, and there's always another tale waiting in the dark.